Let's bring in Rich Rubino, a political analyst as well as a political historian. As always, Rich, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. I know you don't sleep, so we definitely appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, so first off, before we talk about the presidency here and the race to 270, I do want to touch a little bit on the congressional races, because as we mentioned, the Senate has flipped to Republican control, but all eyes are kind of on the House at this point. So what have you seen? What are you looking for, and what are you waiting to see as far as what happens here?
Yeah, that could be the last guardrail for Democrats on President Trump, assuming President Trump is in fact elected president. It's the House of Representatives. The United States Senate, it appears, has gone Republican. This is going to be a very odd situation where in an election you have a scenario where the Senate goes from Republican or Democrat to Republican, and the House, contrary-wise, goes from Republican to Democrat. I think Akeem Jeffries is poised to essentially become the next Speaker of the House. It'll be an interesting dynamic to see what his relationship is with the new Senate Majority Leader, whether it's John Thune of South Dakota, John Cornyn of Texas, or Rick Scott of Florida, or perhaps even somebody else. It's just going to be a different dynamic. I think that the Democrats certainly have the edge right now. There are many seats still close to call. There might be a couple of Democrats who represent Trump-type districts that are kind of on the edge right now. I think Marie Perez is one of them, and Congresswoman from Washington State. Another one is Jared Golden from Maine. So there's really a litany of outstanding races right now.
What happens if, I mean, you have Republican control of the presidency and then you have Republican control of both houses of Congress there? What does that mean overall? What does that say, and what happens next?
Well, first of all, real control of the United States Senate is 60 votes, because that's what you need to be filibuster proof. Of course, theoretically, they could use the nuclear option and just eliminate the filibuster, and the Republicans would have the votes to do that, assuming they stand in unison in doing that. But what it does mean is that theoretically, if Donald Trump is to get legislation through the United States Congress, he has to work with the House of Representatives. Now, how does he do that? The first thing he has to do is he has to have just about every Republican unified behind him. And for some Republicans, particularly those who represent, say, some of the congressional districts in New York State who just barely held on, in congressional districts that are likely to go for Vice President Harris, it's in their best political interest to vote against him, to vote against the president, because then they can go back in 2026 running for re-election, because everything's about a campaign. It's just all perpetual. They can go back in 2026 and say, look, I voted against the president. Now, on the other hand, there are some Democrats, like I say, if someone like Marie Perez gets reelected, Jared Golden's reelected, Matt Cartwright in Pennsylvania, Marcy Kaptur in Ohio, they can represent congressional districts. Mary Portola, she gets reelected in Alaska as well. They represent congressional districts that voted for Donald Trump last time. That voted for Donald Trump this time as well. They need to be able to go back to their constituents in 2026 and say, look, I voted with Donald Trump on this piece of legislation. So perhaps he'll have to work across the aisle to get some of those Democrats to vote with him. On other issues like trade, for example, he has very much, this is really where the right kind of meets left, where it's kind of like, how do you do? He has some Democrats on the far left of the Democratic Party that he could work with to try to restrict trade, for example, and he can work with them and working against sometimes some center Republicans, for example, trying to get tariffs through.
When you look at the Associated Press and just kind of the information that's come in, especially as you're talking about the presidential race, the electoral votes, what stood out to you overall as to what we've seen happen this time around versus maybe 2020?
I think how Donald Trump has overperformed in certain areas, particularly with the Latino vote. He did extremely well, upwards of 45%, if you can believe it, with the Latino vote. There was some talk about perhaps that the Puerto Rican joke at the Madison Square Garden would galvanize some Puerto Ricans to come out and vote against Donald Trump. It appears that did not happen. But I think also working class voters, the fact that Democrats just have not been able to break the lock in terms that Donald Trump really has in terms of many working class voters, particularly white voters without college degrees. That's Donald Trump's bailiwick, if you will. That's his wheelhouse. And for if the Democrats are to be a majority party again, they really have to go back to where they were when they were winning that constituency. Like, for example, under Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, Donald Trump really knows how to appeal to that constituency. And I think that his economic nationalism when it comes to issues like trade, for example, really appeals to folks in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in places where they blame trade for the losses of jobs.
What are you waiting to see today? Because obviously we are still waiting on some of those races to be called by the Associated Press. We're looking at 267 electoral votes for Donald Trump, so just 3 away from that 270 mark. Kamala Harris obviously trailing at this point. But what are you waiting to see as far as what information does come in?
The House of Representatives, certainly. I'm also watching the Senate races. One of them is Montana. John Tester represents a state that last time around went 16 points for Donald Trump. John Tester is an endangered Democrat. I want to see what his final results are and how he's obviously was running ahead of the national party. If there's anything that's reverse coattails, perhaps for Vice President Harris on John Tester's campaign. I want to see what the final results are there, and certainly the state of Wisconsin as well. I think it's just a matter of how big of a majority Donald Trump will have in the United States Senate. Of course, again, if you don't eliminate the filibuster, you really need 60 votes to get anything through. And certainly, he's going to have a situation also in the United States Senate where he is going to have to work across the aisle. And some folks in certainly are kind of advertise the fact that they voted with Donald Trump, and it looks like they did not do too well. You had Sherrod Brown and Robert Casey, respectively, advertise the fact that they supported Donald Trump on trade. It didn't seem to have worked for them. So it'd be very interesting to see Democrats, specifically Democrats up in 2026. They need to show, in some respect, how they work with Donald Trump so they can go in 2026 in moderate to conservative states and say, look at this, I worked on this legislation with Donald Trump. So that's advantageous for the former president.
A lot of folks who were there last night at Kamala Harris's party did expect to hear from her. That was over at Howard University. We're told, of course, that she did not speak last night, but could potentially speak today. What do you think we are going to hear from her when she does speak? I know she's watching the races just like everyone else is.
I think she was extremely surprised, as was Hillary Clinton in 2016. I think the fact that she got about 75,000 people on the Washington Mall, I think that she probably expected that she was going to win. She was probably already preparing for the transition period. I think she's probably really disconsolate, distraught right now. So she's going to try to write a speech, and she's going to try to, I think, talk about, particularly for women and girls, that they do have a chance of becoming president of the United States and running for office, and say something to the effect of, that we need leaders for the future and don't keep your head down. Colin Elwood, the congressman from Texas who lost the Senate race to Ted Cruz, gave a very similar speech saying, don't put your head down. Now it's time to fight, that type of a thing. That's my guess on what her speechwriters are probably working on right now.
All right. Rich Rubino, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and help break it all down. Anything else you want to add here about really any of this before I let you go?
Yes, I would just say that this is an election. This is an election season. It's really, there are 3 branches of government. Obviously, for Donald Trump, he needs the United States Senate, but he also needs the House of Representatives. It's going to be very interesting in terms of how, particularly, he tweets. The Democrats represent congressional districts that are that the congressional districts that have many Republicans in them. He's probably going to use his platform on social media to try to persuade them to vote with him. Once again, for some of the congressmen, if you're a congressman in a place like Long Island, it's actually that did not vote for Donald Trump. It's actually to their political benefit to vote against Donald Trump, and that's really the headwinds he's going to have to face in the next 4 years.
All right, Rich, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Hopefully you can get some sleep, but I imagine probably not.